The morning started the way most mornings did outside Buckingham Palace, with pigeons, tourists, and the low hum of London traffic crawling through the gates like it always had, patient and indifferent. The sky was the color of old dishwater, the kind of gray that doesn't threaten rain but doesn't promise sun either, just sits there, heavy and non-committal, the way London skies tend to do in early spring when the city hasn't quite made up its mind about the season. Guard James Whitmore had been standing at his post for 2 hours and 14 minutes. He knew this not because he checked his watch. Guards don't check their watches, not visibly, not in a way that could be photographed and made into a headline, but because he had counted the tourist groups. 11 of them. The 12th was assembling now, a cluster of matching yellow lanyards and confused expressions, orbiting a woman holding an umbrella above her head in the way tour guides everywhere hold umbrellas, like a tiny flag of authority over a small and temporarily obedient nation. James was good at his job. He was the kind of good that doesn't announce itself, not decorated good, not promoted fast good, but steady good, reliable good, the kind of good that gets you trusted with the early shift on quiet days because his superiors knew he wouldn't drift. 6 years on the palace guard rotation had taught him how to see everything while appearing to see nothing. He could clock a pocket being picked 40 feet away. He could tell the difference between a tourist who was lost and a tourist who was lingering. He had learned, slowly and without anyone telling him directly, that his real job was not to stand still. His real job was to watch. That Tuesday morning, he was watching a family near the iron fence on the south side of the gate. A father in a red waterproof jacket, mother with a camera the size of a small country, and a little girl, maybe 6, maybe 7, who had separated herself from her parents by approximately 4 feet and was staring at James with the focused intensity of a child who has decided that something about the world requires her immediate investigation. Most children stared at the guards. That was normal. That was expected. They stared because the uniforms were strange and large and impressive, because the bearskin hats were taller than their fathers, because it seemed impossible that a person could stand that still. They stared, they waved, they tried to make the guards smile. They eventually gave up and moved on to the gift shop. This girl did not wave. She did not smile. She did not try any of the tricks children usually tried. She just watched him, with her hands clasped behind her back and her chin tilted up at an angle that made her look, James thought, like a very small detective who had found her primary suspect. He kept his gaze forward. Protocol. She took 3 steps closer to the fence. He did not react. She took 1 more step, then stopped, and her voice came through the cold air as clearly as a bell, because children's voices carry in a way adult voices don't, cutting through traffic and wind and the shuffle of camera straps with effortless precision. "Excuse me," she said. James did not respond. He was not supposed to respond. He kept his eyes ahead, on the middle distance, on the invisible point that guards are trained to fix their attention to, that specific quality of focused non-focus that is itself a kind of skill. "Excuse me," she said again, louder, polite but entirely unintimidated by the silence. "I need to tell you something." Her mother called her name from behind. "Lily." With the specific exhausted tone of a parent who has spent the last 40 minutes managing a small person's curiosity in a large public space and is running low on patience and coffee. The girl did not move. "There's a van," she said. "It's been there a long time." James's eyes did not move. But something in the back of his training shifted, quiet and automatic, the way a compass needle moves when something magnetic gets close. He didn't look at her. He didn't acknowledge her. But he heard her. He was listening with the part of him that never really stopped. "It hasn't moved," she said, "since we got here. And the windows are all covered up inside. And there's a smell." Her mother reached her then, apologetic hands on small shoulders, already turning her away. "I'm so sorry," the mother said to James, though James hadn't reacted and gave her no indication he'd heard anything at all. She notices things." "Come on, Lily." Lily let herself be turned. But she looked back at James once over her shoulder, and the look on her face was not the look of a child who had been silly or embarrassed or distracted. It was the look of a child who had said something important and was not yet sure it had landed. James stood still for another 4 minutes. His expression did not change. His posture did not change. His eyes moved barely, almost imperceptibly, to the left, toward the service lane that ran along the western boundary of the palace grounds. The lane that delivery vehicles used. The lane that should have been empty on a Tuesday morning in the gap between scheduled deliveries. There was a van. White. Parked at an angle that was not quite right, not the angle of a vehicle that had stopped temporarily, but the angle of a vehicle that had been left. The kind of distinction that most people would not notice, and James had spent 6 years training himself to notice. He couldn't see the back windows clearly from his position. But the van had been there when he came on shift. He knew that. He registered it now, the way you register something in peripheral memory when something later makes it relevant. It had been there, and he had categorized it as a delivery vehicle on break and filed it away. That had been over 2 hours ago. No delivery vehicle stays parked for over 2 hours. He keyed his radio with a movement so practiced it was nearly invisible. One press. The code for a non-urgent check request. Then, he went back to standing, back to watching, back to the yellow lanyards and the pigeons and the gray sky. The response came back in his earpiece 40 seconds later. 2 words from the gate control officer, checking it. James kept standing. He thought about the girl. About the word she had used, smell. Not color, not noise, not the way adults usually describe suspicious things, in terms of what they could see or calculate. She had described a smell. Children were closer to the ground than adults, literally and, in terms of attention. They noticed different things. Smell was not the detail a person invented when they were making something up for attention. The radio cracked. A different voice this time, the shift supervisor, with the specific flatness in his tone that meant he was working to keep something out of his voice. Whitmore. Stay on post. Sending Morrison to your position for handoff. Do not leave the gate. In 6 years, James had been told to stay on post during a handoff exactly once. During a bomb threat in 2019 that turned out to be an abandoned shopping bag full of textbooks. The handoff protocol existed for situations where something needed to be investigated quietly, without disrupting the perimeter, without signaling to whoever might be watching that anything had changed. He stood very still. The yellow lanyard group moved on. A new group arrived, blue lanyards this time, slightly smaller. A man near the fence raised a phone to take a photograph and James looked exactly as he was supposed to look, ceremonial, fixed, part of the architecture. Morrison arrived 7 minutes later, materializing beside him with a quiet professionalism that years of training made look completely natural, like a simple shift change, nothing to see, nothing to interest the cameras. I've got it, Morrison said under his breath. Briefing room. Now. James walked. Measured steps, correct pace, the walk of a man going exactly where he is supposed to go at exactly the time he is supposed to go there. Inside, in the small security briefing room near the staff entrance, the shift supervisor was standing over a monitor. 2 other people were in the room that James didn't recognize, not in uniform, not in palace staff livery, in the kind of clothing that is deliberately unremarkable. James had been in security long enough to recognize people who were dressed to be forgettable. The monitor showed a camera feed. The white van. Close up. Your call came in 2 minutes before this, the supervisor said, turning to look at James. 2 minutes. We were already getting a flag from street-level sensors on the western lane. Your call confirmed it. Who gave you the tip? James thought about Lily and her clasped hands and her chin tilted up and the look she gave him over her shoulder. A member of the public, he said. A child. She said the van hadn't moved and the windows were covered and there was a smell. The 2 people in unremarkable clothing exchanged a glance. How old? One of them asked. 6. Maybe 7. There was a silence in the room that had a particular quality to it, not uncomfortable, not confused, but recalibrating. The kind of silence that happens when something small has turned out to be significant and everyone in the room is adjusting their understanding of the last 10 minutes accordingly. On the monitor, the white van sat at its slightly wrong angle in the service lane, doing nothing, saying nothing, keeping whatever it contained entirely to itself. All right, the supervisor said. Here's what we know. And the briefing began. James listened. He was very good at listening. He thought, while he listened, about the thousands of tourists who walked past the palace every day, past the guards and the gates and the iron fence, taking photographs and buying postcards and occasionally shouting things at the guards to try to make them smile. He thought about how many of them looked and how few of them saw. He thought about a little girl in a family of tourists who had separated herself by 4 feet from her parents and stood very still and watched, and had noticed something that 2 hours of trained professional observation had filed away under unimportant. The briefing room felt smaller than it usually did. The feed from the camera was very steady. Outside, in the grey London morning, the palace sat as it always sat, enormous, permanent, present, the way things that contain history tend to sit. And, in the service lane along its western boundary, a white van with covered windows and a smell that a 7-year-old had noticed stayed very still, and waited, and did not move. Whatever was inside it had not counted on Lily. That was the first mistake. There would be others, but this was the one that started everything, the first small thread pulled, the first thing noticed by the only person on that entire street who was still close enough to the ground, close enough to something genuine and unfiltered, to see what was actually there. An adult had filed the van away. A child had stood at a fence and said, "Excuse me. I need to tell you something." And now the people in unremarkable clothing were in a room, watching a monitor, and the white van was very still, and the grey sky outside was beginning, almost reluctantly, to consider the possibility of rain. James Whitmore stood in the briefing room and thought about how the best security systems in the world, the cameras, the sensors, the protocols, the 6 years of trained observation, had been outpaced, that morning, by a girl who noticed a smell. He kept that thought where thoughts go when they are too large for the moment, quietly, away, for later. There was work to do. There was still, as there always was, work to do. The supervisor clicked to a second camera feed. "Here," he said. "Look at this." Everyone in the room looked. And what they saw on that monitor changed the shape of the morning entirely, pulled it from routine into something that none of them would talk about the way they talked about other days, something that would settle into their professional lives the way significant things settle, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, the way a stone settles into the bed of a river and stays there, beneath everything, altering the current in ways that take a long time to fully understand. James looked at the screen. He kept his face steady. That was his job. That was what 6 years had built in him. But his hands, at his sides, pressed very slightly against his thighs. And, in the palace beyond the briefing room, and, in the grey morning beyond the palace, and, in the service lane where the van sat at its slightly wrong angle, something that had been hidden was beginning, very slowly, to be found. The second camera feed showed the van from a different angle, the one mounted higher, on the lamppost at the corner of the service lane, the camera that recorded continuously and was reviewed only when something triggered a review. This angle showed the van's passenger side. It showed the gap between the van's sliding door and its frame. Small. Maybe 2 centimeters. The kind of gap that exists when a door has been closed but not fully latched, or when something inside is pressing against it from within with a pressure too light to force it open but too steady to allow it to fully close. The gap was moving. Not swinging, not rattling, moving. Rhythmically. In the specific slow pulse of something alive. The supervisor let the footage run for 11 seconds without speaking. Nobody in the room spoke. The footage ran and the gap in the van door moved in its slow, rhythmic way, and the silence in the briefing room had changed again, thickened into something with actual weight that James could feel against his sternum. "Thermal imaging came in 4 minutes ago," one of the people in unremarkable clothing said. Her voice was very controlled. "There are 2 heat signatures in the vehicle. Both relatively small. One stationary. One moving, limited range of motion." She paused. "The moving one has been moving for approximately 90 minutes. James absorbed this. 2 heat signatures. Small. 90 minutes of movement. The supervisor looked at him. "You said the child described a smell." "Yes." "She used that word specifically?" "Smell?" "She said there was a smell." She didn't describe what kind. The woman in unremarkable clothing made a small note on a phone screen, the kind of note-taking that looks like texting but isn't. Children are often better at that than adults, she said, without looking up. Adults filter sensory information through context. Children don't have the same filters. They report what they perceive without first deciding whether it's relevant. She paused. It's one of the reasons witness testimony from children in certain cases is actually more reliable than adult testimony. They haven't learned what to ignore yet. James thought about Lily standing at the fence with her hands behind her back. He thought about her saying the word smell in that clear, specific way, the way a child names a thing without dressing it up, without hedging it. Just here is the thing I noticed, here is the fact of it. What are we dealing with? He asked. He kept his voice even. The supervisor looked at the woman in unremarkable clothing. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that James read as the decision about how much to say in this room, at this moment, to this person. We don't know yet, she said. That's what we're about to find out. The operation that followed had a quality of controlled speed that James had been trained to recognize, not the running, shouting, visible urgency of a crisis response, but the kind of speed that looks slow from the outside because every movement has been made precise. The kind of speed that comes from people who have prepared for this, not this specific thing, not this specific van, but the category of this, the shape of it, and who are now moving through their training the way water moves through a known channel. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Just the work. James was not part of the response team. His job had been done. He had called in the check request, he had given his information, and now the machinery he had set in motion was moving on its own. He was returned to his post, not dismissed, returned, which was different, which carried the implication that he was still needed on that line, still necessary to the appearance of normalcy that the palace's outer perimeter needed to maintain. He walked back to the gate. Morrison gave him a nod and moved off. The yellow lanyard group had gone. The blue lanyard group had also gone, replaced by a new cluster of people who were taking photographs of the gates with the dedicated focus of tourists who have waited a long time to be here and intend to photograph it properly. A man was trying to get his child to look at the camera. The child was looking at the guards instead, which James thought was probably the right choice. He stood at his post. 50 meters to his left, behind the angle of the building, in the service lane that was not visible from his current position, something was happening. He could not see it. He could hear nothing. The operation was designed to produce nothing audible, to generate no noise that would carry to the street. He stood at his gate and watched the tourists and waited and felt the particular quality of not knowing that exists when you have started something and cannot watch it finish. 22 minutes passed. In those 22 minutes, 3 children waved at him. He did not smile. He did not wave back. He thought about Lily each time, could not entirely stop thinking about her, about the fact that she was now somewhere in London, inside a double-decker bus or a gift shop or a cafe, eating a pastry and asking her parents questions about something entirely unrelated to vans and palace service lanes, probably unaware that the thing she had reported had become, in the 40 minutes since, something that 15 trained people in unremarkable clothing were actively working to resolve. She would not find out. That was how it worked. The people who noticed things rarely found out what became of their noticing. They went on with their days. The machinery moved without them. The radio cracked in his ear. The shift supervisor's voice. Still flat, still controlled, but with something underneath it now that James recognized, not relief exactly, not satisfaction, but the specific release of tension that occurs when a worst-case scenario has been prevented from fully becoming itself. Whitmore. Information only. 2 individuals retrieved from the vehicle. 1 adult male, 1 juvenile female. Both alive. Medics on site. A pause. Good call this morning. James kept his eyes on the middle distance. He said nothing. He pressed the acknowledgement key once and held himself very still. 1 adult male. 1 juvenile female. He turned this over in his mind with the careful, methodical attention he gave to information that needed to be understood before it could be filed. Not a threat to the palace. Not whatever the shape of fear that had been building in the briefing room, not that. Something else. Something that had its own gravity, its own weight, its own particular horror that existed entirely apart from the palace and the gate and the ceremony of his job. He thought about the gap in the sliding door. The rhythmic movement. The heat signature that had been moving for 90 minutes, limited range of motion. He thought about the word juvenile. He kept standing. That was his job. He kept standing. The story of what had been inside the van did not come to James all at once. It came in the way these things come to people on the perimeter of events, in fragments, over time, each fragment arriving through a different channel, a word from a colleague at shift change, a detail overheard in the break room, a sentence from the supervisor that was not technically a briefing but functioned as one. The full picture assembled slowly, the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, shapes emerging from gray until the whole thing becomes clear. The adult male was 53 years old. He had been found in the driver's seat, unconscious, the result of what appeared to be an acute medical event, a cardiac episode, the medics believed, possibly brought on by prolonged stress or a pre-existing condition or the specific compounding misery of whatever he had been doing parked in that lane for over 2 hours before his body refused to continue. He had a record. Not a significant record, not the record of someone who had planned something large, but a record of smaller things, the kind of record that is built by a person whose life has been repeatedly going sideways in small increments until it goes sideways in a larger one. The juvenile female was 9 years old. She was in the back of the van. She had been in the back of the van for what investigators would later estimate was somewhere between 3 and 5 hours. She was physically unharmed. Dehydrated. Frightened to a degree that the responding medic described in their report as significant dissociation, the child had retreated, in the way children sometimes do under extreme stress, into a very quiet internal place from which she took some time to return. Her name was not immediately established. She did not give her name when asked. She looked at the people around her with the eyes of a person who has been in the dark for a long time and is not yet sure that the light is safe. She had been reported missing 36 hours earlier from a home in East London. The report had been filed. The investigation had been opened. But 36 hours is both a very long time and not very long at all in the mathematics of missing persons cases, and the investigative resources had not yet converged on the service lane of Buckingham Palace as a location of interest, because why would they? Because who would take a child there? Because the palace, with its cameras and its guards and its perimeter systems, was one of the last places a person doing something wrong would choose to stop. Except, James thought, when he had assembled enough of the picture to understand it, except when a person doing something wrong is no longer capable of making good decisions. Except when a person doing something wrong has had a cardiac event while parked in a lane they chose because it was quiet at that hour, because the early morning service lane had no regular traffic at that time on a Tuesday, and has lost consciousness at the wheel, leaving the sliding door of the van not fully latched, leaving the gap to move in a slow rhythmic pulse that a thermal imaging camera would read as a heat signature with limited range of motion. He had not chosen the palace. He had collapsed near it. And the child in the back had pushed at the door, again and again, not hard enough to open it, not with enough strength or leverage, but enough. Enough to create the gap. Enough to let the smell, whatever the smell was, warm interior air, the specific human scent of distress and hours and no water leak out into the cold morning of the service lane. Where a family of tourists had walked. Where a girl named Lily had separated herself from her parents by 4 feet and tilted her chin up and stood very still and paid attention. James stood at his post and thought about the gap between what nearly happened and what actually happened, the thin, specific distance between the two. He thought about 90 minutes of a small body pressing at a door, and the thermal camera that had flagged the movement, and the call he had made that had confirmed it, and the call he had made because a 7-year-old had used the word smell at a palace gate. He thought about how many tourist groups passed this gate every day. He thought about how many people had walked the western boundary of the grounds that morning without looking at the service lane at all, or looking and seeing a white van and filing it correctly under irrelevant. He thought about the compounding series of things that had to be true simultaneously. The gap had to exist, the air had to carry, the tourists had to walk close enough, the girl had to be paying the specific quality of attention she had been paying, the guard had to be James Whitmore, who spent 6 years learning to listen to small details before deciding they were nothing. He thought about the girl in the back of the van, in the dark, pushing at a door. He kept his face exactly as it needed to be. He kept his posture exactly as it needed to be. The tourists took their photographs and moved on and were replaced by other tourists who took their photographs and moved on. The sky continued its gray indecision. A pigeon landed on the gatepost 4 feet from James's position and regarded him with one orange eye before deciding he was not interesting and flying away. Shift change came at 2 o'clock. James walked through it with the same measured professionalism he walked through everything. In the locker room, putting on his civilian jacket, one of the other guards, older, someone James had worked alongside for 3 years without ever having a conversation longer than 7 minutes, stopped next to him and said, quietly, the kind of quiet that is very aware of the room, heard about this morning. James said nothing. Good ears, the guard said. And walked out. James stood in the locker room for a moment after he left. Good ears. It was the kind of compliment that contained a small correction, the credit going to James, to his training, to his instincts, to 6 years of learning to listen. Which was fair, which was accurate, which was part of the story. But the other part of the story was a 7-year-old girl with her hands clasped behind her back who had looked at him over her shoulder with the expression of a person who has said something important and is not sure it has landed. He picked up his bag. He walked out into the grey London afternoon. He didn't know her last name. He didn't know what city she had come from or how long she was visiting or where she was going that afternoon, back to a hotel, probably, to a dinner somewhere, to a day that would settle in her memory as the day she went to see Buckingham Palace and tried to talk to the guard and the guard didn't answer and her mother pulled her away and then they went somewhere and had sandwiches or fish and chips or whatever the family had for lunch on London tourist days. She would not remember it as the day she found a missing child. She probably didn't know that yet. Maybe she would find out later, in a news report, in the way these things sometimes surface through the thin membrane between official and public, and she would look at her parents and say, that was me, that was the palace, that was the guard I tried to talk to. Or maybe she would never find out, and the thing she had done would sit in the world without her knowing it, the way most things that matter sit in the world, unattributed, uncelebrated, just present, just real, just part of the fabric of what actually happened. James walked to the tube station. He thought about all of this on the platform, in the specific half-absent way the end of a long shift produces. The train came. He got on it. He went home. And, in a hospital somewhere in London, a 9-year-old girl who had been in the dark was in a room with light, and people who were gentle with her, and water, and the beginning of the long slow process of returning from wherever she had gone inside herself when the dark got to be too much. She was not yet speaking. But she was there. That was the part that mattered. She was there, her name was Amara. She told them this on the second day, when the doctor, a woman with a quiet voice and very steady hands who had been specifically trained for this kind of conversation and who never rushed anything, never filled silences the way most people felt compelled to fill silences, sat with her in the room with the yellow curtains and the window that looked out onto a small courtyard where there was a tree that was just beginning to think about leaves. Amara. Said in the way a child says their own name when they are not yet entirely sure they are safe saying it, quietly, testing the air around it, watching to see what the word does when it lands. The doctor wrote it down without making it a large moment. Just the name. Just ordinary. Just yours, we have it now, we're keeping it. The hospital room had a specific quality that children's hospital rooms tend to have when the staff know what they are doing, not cheerful exactly, not the aggressively bright primary color cheerfulness of a waiting room designed to manage anxiety, but warm. Considered. The kind of room that has been put together by people who understand that a child who has been frightened needs not distraction but steadiness, not noise but the particular comfort of things staying where they are. Amara was 9 years old and she had been missing for 36 hours before she was found, which meant she had been wherever she was before the van for approximately 33 of those hours, a period that the investigators were building a picture of carefully, the way investigators build pictures, from the outside in, from the verifiable details inward toward the thing at the center that is hardest to look at directly. She had been taken from outside her school. That was the beginning of it. walking the 3 minutes between the school gate and the corner where her grandmother waited every day at 3:30, a walk she had made hundreds of times, a walk that took her past a newsagent and a dry cleaner and a parking area used by the businesses on that street, a walk that had never been anything other than 3 unremarkable minutes until the afternoon when it was. Her grandmother had waited at the corner at 3:30 and Amara had not come. The grandmother had waited 9 minutes before she started walking toward the school. She had covered half the distance before she encountered the teacher who had seen Amara leave through the gate with a man the teacher had not recognized but had not flagged because the man had not grabbed or shouted or done any of the things that would signal to a watching adult that something was wrong. He had said something to Amara. She had hesitated. She had gone with him. Children go with adults who say the right things. This is not a failure of the child. This is not a failure of instinct or intelligence or caution. This is the careful, deliberate exploitation of the way children have been taught to respond to adults who seem to know something about their parents, about their family, about an emergency that requires them right now to come, quickly. It's okay, you're not in trouble. The grandmother is hurt. Your mother needs you. Something has happened and I'm here to take you there. These were the things the man had said, or words similar enough that they functioned the same way. The investigation would establish this slowly, through conversations with Amara that were measured in minutes and conducted with a patience that a 9-year-old who has been through what she had been through required and deserved. The man was the one they had found unconscious in the driver's seat. 53 years old. Not a stranger to Amara in the sense of being entirely unknown, he existed at the outermost edge of her family's social geography, a person known by name but not by presence, someone who had appeared 2 or 3 times at family gatherings years before Amara had been old enough to remember clearly. Which was the point. Which was why he had been the one they chose for this, because this was not a solo operation, because the man in the driver's seat had not done this alone, which was the part the investigators were still building, still mapping, still finding the edges of. Someone had calculated that Amara was the right child. Someone had calculated that this man was the right person to approach her, known enough to be not quite a stranger, obscure enough to be not immediately questioned. Someone had planned this with a precision that required information about Amara's school, her route, her grandmother's pickup schedule. That information came from somewhere. From someone who had access to the ordinary shape of her ordinary days and had watched them long enough to find the gap. This was the subterranean architecture of the thing, not the van, not the gate, not the palace service lane, but the slow, patient watching that had preceded all of it, the months of observation that the man in the driver's seat had not done alone because he was not that kind of person, not patient enough, not organized enough. He was the end of a chain that started somewhere else and wound through people and money and arrangements that the investigators would spend many more weeks tracing back to their source. Amara did not know any of this. She knew the inside of a van, and the dark, and the way the metal floor felt against her hands when she pushed at the door, again and again, because she had decided that stopping was not something she was going to do. She had decided this at some point in the dark, not in words, not in a conscious formulation, but in the way 9-year-old girls who have been underestimated make their most important decisions, in the body, in the muscles, in the part of a person that doesn't ask permission before it acts. She had pushed at the door for 90 minutes. She had not opened it. But she had opened it enough, moved it enough, created the gap that let the air through, that let the thermal camera see a heat signature with limited range of motion, that let the cold London morning carry whatever smell she had accumulated in 3 to 5 hours of being inside a parked vehicle in a palace service lane. Lily, on the outside, at the fence, had smelled it. This was the thing that James Whitmore turned over in his mind on his days off, in the week that followed. He had not been briefed formally, the investigation was ongoing, the details were controlled, but the fragments had assembled themselves through the channels they always assembled through, and he had the shape of it now, if not the specifics. He thought about Amara pushing at a door, and Lily standing at a fence, and the two of them unknowing of each other, the 9-year-old in the dark and the 7-year-old in the grey London morning, separated by a distance of maybe 60 meters and everything in the world, connected by a gap in a sliding door and the air between them. He thought about the grandmother at the corner at 3:30. He thought about 9 minutes of waiting. He thought about how the grandmother would spend the rest of her life reorganizing those 9 minutes in her memory, looking for what she could have done differently, which was nothing, which was the cruelest part. There was nothing. The 9 minutes were not the failure, the watching had preceded the 9 minutes by months, and the watching was not something the grandmother could have seen or stopped. The investigators found Amara's family 2 hours after finding Amara. Her mother came to the hospital first, then her grandmother, and James knew none of the details of those reunions because he was not in the hospital and was not informed, and knew he would not be, and accepted this the way he accepted most things in his work, as part of the shape of it, as the nature of a job that involves many beginnings and very few endings that arrive fully resolved. He knew only that she was there. That she was in the room with the yellow curtains and the window with the tree thinking about leaves. That she had said her name on the second day. That she was talking, slowly, in measured minutes. Back at the palace, the service lane returned to its ordinary function. Delivery vehicles came and went on their scheduled intervals. The lamppost camera continued its continuous recording. The gate continued its cycles of tourists and lanyards and children trying to make the guards smile. The grey sky eventually made up its mind and produced 2 days of proper London rain, the kind that is not dramatic but is entirely committed, soaking steadily into everything. James was back on shift by Thursday. His post, his gait, his middle-distance gaze, his practiced stillness. A new rotation of tourists. New yellow lanyards, new cameras, new children lifted to their parents' shoulders to see above the fence. A boy of about 10 tried to make him blink by waving a hand very fast in front of his own face in a gesture clearly intended to demonstrate blinking, as if James might feel competitive about it. James kept his eyes exactly where they were. The boy ran back to his family, delighted by the failure, already constructing the story of this for later. The guard who never blinked, I waved right in front of my own face and everything. In the break room, 3 days into the return to routine, James sat with his coffee and opened his phone and looked at the local news. He did this sometimes when he was looking for nothing specific, just the texture of what was happening in the city, the way it assembled itself from the small stories that the larger channels didn't follow. There was a brief item, brief, carefully worded, vague in the specific way of official statements that contain genuine gratitude without containing details that would compromise an ongoing investigation, from the Metropolitan Police. It said that a child who had been reported missing had been recovered safely in the Buckingham Palace area, and that the recovery was due in part to a member of the public who had reported concerns, and that the matter remained under active investigation. Member of the public. James looked at this phrase. He thought about Lily. He thought about her hands clasped behind her back, her chin tilted up, her voice clear in the cold air. I need to tell you something. He thought about the way she had looked at him over her shoulder, the look of a person who has said an important thing and is waiting to see if it has landed. He hoped, somewhere in the fabric of wherever she was now, back home, probably, in whatever city her family had come from, probably not thinking about the palace at all, probably thinking about school tomorrow or something she wanted for her birthday or an argument she'd had with a sibling about something that had felt urgent this morning, that she somehow knew. That the thing she had done had arrived. That it had mattered. He knew she probably didn't know. He knew that was probably fine, that a 7-year-old didn't need to carry the weight of knowing what her noticing had set in motion, that there was something clean about doing the right thing and simply moving through your day not knowing the consequences, not counting them or claiming them, just doing it and going. He finished his coffee. He went back to his post. And, in a hospital with yellow curtains and a window with a tree, a girl named Amara looked out at the courtyard and said something to the doctor who never rushed anything, said it quietly and, in pieces, the way a person begins to return from a very far distance, one word, then another, then a sentence, then something that was almost a story, then something that was a story, the story of the door and the dark and the pushing and the air. The doctor wrote it all down. She did not fill any of the silences. She let the story come at the speed it came. Outside, the tree was beginning to make its decision about the leaves. The courtyard held the afternoon light in the specific gold way of early spring light, the kind that arrives unexpectedly after a stretch of gray and makes everyone who sees it feel, briefly and without quite knowing why, that something good is still possible, that the world has not entirely made up its mind yet, that there is still time for things to turn in a better direction. Amara looked at the light on the tree. The doctor waited. After a while, Amara said something else. And, the doctor wrote it down. The investigation took 11 weeks. Not the part of it that involved Amara, the medical side of that, the interviews, the careful reconstructions, the sessions with the doctor in the room with the yellow curtains that took longer, took months, took the slow and patient work of rebuilding something that had been broken in a specific and deliberate way. But the investigative side, the part that traced the chain backward from the man in the driver's seat to the thing at the other end of it, took 11 weeks and involved 7 people and crossed 3 different jurisdictions and produced, at the end of it, a set of charges that the investigative team delivered to the Crown Prosecution Service on a Thursday afternoon in late May, when London had finally committed to spring and the trees along the mall were full and the tourists outside. The palace were in lighter jackets and the pigeons were behaving with the specific boldness that warm weather produces in pigeons. James Whitmore knew none of the specific details of those 11 weeks. He was not a party to the investigation. His role had ended at the call he had made on the radio on that grey Tuesday morning, at the information he had given in the briefing room, at the steady, practiced normality he had maintained at his post while the work happened behind him. He was a perimeter. He was good at being a perimeter. He went home on the tube and came back on the tube and stood at the gate and watched the tourists and kept the vast complicated machinery of his interiority from showing on his face. He heard things, over 11 weeks, in the way that people on the edges of events hear things imprecisely, at intervals, carrying the particular quality of information that is not quite confirmed and not quite rumor, that lives in the space between them. He heard that the man in the driver's seat had given information from the hospital bed. He heard that the information had led somewhere useful. He heard that useful had led to significant. He heard, 6 weeks in, from a colleague who had a cousin in the Met's Serious Crime Division and who exercised the kind of discretion that kept information functional rather than widely spread, that the network the man had pointed toward was larger than the service lane, larger than the van, larger than the single child taken from a school route on a Wednesday afternoon. He kept this where he kept things. In the quiet place. He went back to standing. He watched a new generation of tourists take photographs of a building they had come very far to see. Amara went home in the 3rd week of April. This James did not hear from his colleague with the cousin. He heard this from no one. He read it, briefly, in a single line in a local newspiece that was itself brief and carefully vague. The child recovered in the Buckingham Palace area had been discharged from medical care and reunited with her family, and the ongoing investigation continued, and if anyone had information they were asked to contact the Metropolitan Police at the number below. He read it on his phone during his lunch break, standing in the car park behind the staff entrance because he wanted to read it with some air around him, not in the break room where conversations were always happening at the edges of the space. He read the line about going home. He thought about what going home meant after what she had been through, not the physical going home, not the geography of it, but the conceptual problem of it. The way home was both the right word and an entirely insufficient one, because home was where you were before, and before is a place you cannot get back to exactly as it was, can only approach from the new angle that everything after has given you. She would go home. She would sleep in her bed. She would go back to school, probably, eventually, in the way that children are resilient in ways that are both true and genuinely extraordinary. She would carry what she was carrying in the way that people carry the weight of what has happened to them, not visibly always, not in the ways that are legible to others, but continuously, in the body, in the decisions she would make without knowing why she was making them, in the specific qualities of attention she would develop. She would be, from here, a person who had been in the dark and had pushed at a door for 90 minutes and had not opened it and had opened it enough. That was a fact about her now. It was in her. Whether it would become a story she told about herself, or something she kept close and private, or something she eventually placed somewhere that made it useful rather than only heavy, that was hers to decide. None of it was James's to think about. But he thought about it anyway, briefly, in the car park, with the April air doing the thing April air does when it finally means it, filling the space between buildings with something that smells like intention. He put his phone away. He went back inside. The charging announcement came through official channels on a Thursday in late May. It was not released to the general press in the way of a dramatic disclosure. It was registered in the court documents, which then became public record, which then was picked up by a journalist at the Standard who wrote a piece that ran without a front-page placement but with enough detail to constitute a real account of the thing. James read this piece on a Friday evening at home, with tea, in the particular settled feeling of a shift that has ended cleanly and an evening with nothing in it that needs doing. 7 people charged. The man from the driver's seat, recovering from his cardiac event under careful medical supervision and, now under police supervision as well. 6 others at various distances from the van and the school and the service lane and the girl who had walked 3 minutes between the gate and the corner, distances that ranged from 1 step removed to 4 steps removed, connected by the specific financial arrangements that connected people who planned these things, the money that moved between them in ways that the financial investigators had traced with the particular patience that financial investigation requires. The piece was careful. It named no names. It described the network in structural terms, the planning, the communication, the sourcing of information about Amara's schedule that had come, it turned out, from a person at the edge of her mother's professional life, a person who had appeared unremarkable for long enough to be trusted with the ordinary details of ordinary days before they sold those details to people who used them for this. James read the piece slowly. He set down his tea somewhere in the middle of it and did not pick it back up. He read to the end. There was, at the end, a paragraph about the recovery itself, vague, official language vague, but present. It said that the child had been discovered as the result of a report by a member of the public to an on-duty security officer, whose immediate action had initiated the response that led to the recovery. It used the word immediate in a way that James noted without vanity, as an accurate word, as the thing that had in fact happened. Member of the public. He thought about this phrase again, the way he had thought about it before. He thought about how much was compressed inside it, the yellow lanyards and the gray sky and the 4 feet of separation from the parents and the chin tilted up and the clear voice in the cold air saying, "I need to tell you something." He thought about how the entire chain, the thermal camera, the briefing room, the people in unremarkable clothing, the 11 weeks, the 7 charges ran back through his call and, through the call ran back to a 7-year-old who had smelled something through a 60-meter gap between a van and a fence. Member of the public. He would never know what Lily's parents had told her, if they had told her anything. He would never know if she had seen the news and connected it, or if the connection had never been available to her, if it had remained closed in the way that most things remain closed to the people who start them. He thought about her, occasionally, in the months that followed, not obsessively, not in a way that disrupted anything, but, in the specific way a person thinks about a detail that will not entirely resolve, a small bright thing that sits at the edge of their understanding and catches the light sometimes. She was 7. Maybe she was now 8. Children move through time faster than events. She was probably somewhere doing what 8-year-olds do, some homework, some argument, some game, some worry about something that felt enormous from inside it. She probably did not know that she was, in a real and documentable sense, the first link in a chain that had ended with 7 people charged and 1 9-year-old girl going home to her bed. But that was the nature of first links. They did not announce themselves. They just held. The palace continued to be the palace. The gate continued to be the gate. The tourists continued their orbital relationship with the iron fence and the guards and the bearskin hats and the building that contained, among other things, the centuries-long project of being an institution that endured. James continued to be the kind of guard he had always been, the steady kind, the reliable kind, the kind that knew the difference between a tourist who was lost and a tourist who was lingering, the kind that had spent 6 years learning to hear small things before deciding they were nothing. He was commended. Formally, in the internal channels, through a communication from the shift supervisor to the duty officer to the record, a note attached to his file of the kind that constitutes official acknowledgement in institutions that are careful with their official acknowledgements. He was told about the commendation by the supervisor directly, in the same controlled, flat tone the supervisor used for everything, which was its own kind of respect, the respect of not making it strange or large, just here is the thing, it happened, it is noted, well done. James thanked him. He meant it. He thought about telling the supervisor that the commendation had the wrong address, that it belonged at least half to a 7-year-old tourist who had stood at the fence and noticed a smell and decided that the fence and the uniform and the protocol of not answering were not sufficient reason to stay quiet. He thought about saying this. He did not say it, because there was no mechanism for it, no process by which the commendation could be redirected or shared or attributed to a child whose last name he did not know and whose home city he did not know and who was somewhere in the world, unreachable, probably unaware. He held the commendation and thought about her. He filed it away, in the quiet place, with all the other things that had accumulated there over 6 years of watching. A week after the charging announcement, James was on the early shift when a family stopped at his section of the fence. Tourists. A father with a very large camera, a mother with comfortable shoes and the look of a person who has planned this trip carefully, and a small girl, maybe 6, maybe 8, the age was hard to tell, who had separated from her parents by 4 feet and was watching James with focused attention. He kept his eyes on the middle distance. Protocol. She stood there for a moment, evaluating. Then, she leaned toward the fence and said, with the specific gravity of a child who has decided something important requires reporting, "There's a bird on your hat." James kept his eyes forward. There was, in fact, a pigeon. It had landed on the rim of the bearskin with a confidence that suggested it had done this before and expected no consequences. James could feel its weight. He had been feeling its weight for 2 minutes and had been doing the calculation of how long a pigeon could be on your hat before it constituted a situation rather than a detail. The girl looked at the pigeon. She looked at James. She looked at the pigeon again. "It's been there a while," she said helpfully. Her mother called her name, Sophie, in the specific exhausted tone that meant coffee had worn off. The girl did not move. She kept watching him, with her chin tilted up, with the expression of a person who has noticed something and is waiting to see what the noticing will do. James kept his eyes on the middle distance. He kept them there. He kept his face exactly as it was supposed to be. He kept his posture correct and his hands at his sides and his gaze on the invisible point that guards fix their attention on, that trained non-focus that is itself a skill, that had taken him years to perfect. The pigeon shifted. Reconsidered. Departed. Sophie watched it go with visible satisfaction. She looked back at James. Then, she turned and ran back to her parents, already explaining something at volume, the way children explain things, completely, immediately, as though the world requires the information right now. James stood at his gate. The grey turning to blue London morning continued around him, cars and tourists and pigeons and the low perpetual hum of a city going about its business. The palace sat behind him, enormous and permanent, containing what it contained. The iron fence held its line between inside and outside, between the watched and the watching. He thought about Lily. He thought about Amara. He thought about the door and the dark and the pushing and the gap. He thought about the chain of small things, a gap, a smell, a fence, a child who noticed that had run backward from the service lane to the courtyard with the tree and the yellow curtains and the word home. He thought about Sophie running back to her parents, already 3 subjects past the pigeon, already in whatever came next. He kept standing. That was his job. He kept standing and kept watching and kept being the kind of person who listened to small things before deciding they were nothing. Somewhere in London, in a school that was probably ordinary in every way schools are ordinary, Amara sat in a classroom and did the things that children do in classrooms, wrote something, read something, argued quietly with someone next to her about something that felt important at 8 minutes past 11 on a Thursday morning in late spring. The argument was probably about something small. The argument was probably the right size for the day. The day was probably, if the doctor with the steady hands had done her work, and the family had done theirs, and the time had done what time does, probably manageable. Probably not ordinary yet, probably not entirely, but moving in that direction. Moving, at her own pace, in the direction of ordinary. That was enough. That was what there was to hope for, from this distance, from the gate, from the end of the chain. Not resolution. Not the clean ending that made the story feel finished and safe. Just the ongoing fact of her being there in the classroom, in the argument, in the ordinary difficulty of a Thursday morning that was not the dark, that was not the van, that was just a Thursday, just a morning, just the next thing. James Whitmore stood at his post. The tourists came and went. The sky was doing something hopeful with the light. He kept watching. That was the job. That had always been the job, not the ceremony, not the uniform, not the stillness that tourists photographed and children tested and pigeons treated as architecture. The job was the watching. The sustained, patient, trained attention to the small things that other people's filters told them to ignore. The job was being the person standing at the edge of things who noticed when something was not quite right, who heard a child say "I need to tell you something" and filed it in the place that mattered rather than the place that didn't. The job was holding the line between what nearly happened and what actually happened, the thin and specific line that runs through every ordinary morning without announcing itself, maintained by the people who have learned to maintain it, supported, on the best days, on the days that remind you why any of it matters, by the people who haven't learned yet what to ignore. By the 7-year-olds at the fence who smell something and decide the fence and the silence and the protocol are not sufficient reason to stay quiet. By the people who have not yet learned that noticing is optional. By the ones who tilt their chin up and say, clearly, into the cold London air, "Excuse me. I need to tell you something." And mean it. And are heard.